We'll begin with the Gemara on the Lamed Zayin and Beis. Omar Rabba Bar Chana Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Kotma v'huvara. If the Eish underwent a process of Ketima, as the Rishonim define it, Ketima means that sand or some type of material was used to douse the Gecholim. And then, despite that the Eish underwent a Ketima, Huvara. The Eish then once again became strengthened, and there is a flame. The Gemara then goes on to discuss, can the Kedeira be left on those Gecholim? And the Gemara says, Mashin oleh chamin shehuchmu kol tzarkon, v'tavshil shebishol kol tzarkon. One can leave on those Gecholim a tavshil, which is bishol kol tzarkon, and chamin shehuchmu kol tzarkon. Then the Gemara goes through a Shabbos, and the Gemara says, Shmamino mitstamek yofeloi muter. The Gemara assumes, as the Rishonim say initially, that because the Gecholim are now huvar, they no longer have the status of kotum, in which case we're speaking about a question of shihir on Gecholim that are not kotum, and therefore the Gemara wants to use this memra of Rabba Bar Chana as a proof that the Mishnah is l'shois t'nan and shihir is only mutter in the case of nitzamek v'yofeloi. Says the Gemara, no, shani hocha de kotma. Since at one point the Gecholim underwent a process of ketima, despite the fact that currently they're in a state of huvara, they retain their status of ketuma. This is the basic shaklavatariya of the Gemara. And the Gemara then asks, if the Gecholim have the status of Ketuma, so then what's the Chiddush that there is a heter to be mashe a tavshil? Says the Gemara, Huvara itztirichale. The Chiddush is that itself, that despite the fact that the Gecholim underwent Havara, and now are no longer Kotum, functionally Kotum, then they still maintain their status of Ketuma. This is the basic outline of the sugya, where the Gemara is discussing a question of Gecholim that underwent the process of Ketima and are currently Huvar. Do they have the status of Eish, or do they retain their status of Ketuma? Now, it's important to emphasize by way of introduction to the sugya that the Gemara has made an assumption that if the Gecholim do not retain their status of Ketuma, then it would be osir to leave the Kedeira on the Gecholim. The Gemara Shaklavatariya is Mashin oleh chamin shehuchmu kol tzarkon or not. And the Gemara makes that dependent on whether or not Gecholim having once undergone the process of Ketima, does that retain their status as Kotum, or does it become like Ish? Now, so we're talking about a case where whether it's on Erev Shabbos, as you're asking, or on Shabbos, the Maisa Shehiyah has already taken place, meaning the Gecholim were Kotum and the Kedeira was placed. The Huvara happened inadvertently; it happened by itself. The chiddush that we see in this Gemara is, and this is an additional proof to the svara that we mentioned from the Chazon Ish in last week's limud, that when Chachamim made a gezeira on shehiyah, they were not goizer on the act of shehiyah. They were goizer on the state of shehiyah, in the words of the Chazon Ish, on the matzah of shehiyah. The hainu, the gezeira of the Chachamim wasn't to take the kedeira and place it on the ish, such that it remains through Leil Shabbos, but Chachamim were goizer that one may not have a kedeira on the ish. The chashash of chitui is not because one placed the kedera on the eish, but because the kedera is on the eish. And the proof for that is the premise of this shakla. If the Isser would be placing a kedera on an eish that's not goraf and kotum, then in this case, at the time that the kedera was placed alo eish, it was goraf and kotum. The eish possibly lost its status of goraf and kotum later as a result of huvara, which is the discussion of the Gemara. But the premise of the Gemara is before the shakla begins as to whether or not this eish retains the status of kotum or has now changed to being a conventional eish. The assumption of the Gemara is that were it not to maintain the status of kotum, then the state of shehiyah wouldn't be allowed to continue, which means the kedera would have to be removed, whether it's Erev Shabbos or Shabbos. That state couldn't exist. Or in the Lashon of the Gemara on Daf Lamed Zayin or the Aleph, when the Gemara discusses not the question of huvara, but the question of the slabsa, the Gemara says umekaimim oleha. The issue is whether or not the kedera can be left aloish. So the first point to make as an introduction to the sugya is that this sugya again indicates, like the Chazon Ish says, that the yisoid of the gzeir of shia is not an act of placing a kedera on an eish that's not garif and kotum, but the isser of shia is maintaining a kedera on an eish that's not garif and kotum. Here the person did nothing. It's possible, like we've mentioned before, that we're not even Erev Shabbos anymore. We're in a state where we're now Lil Shabbos Samach L'Suda. And the person notices that it was huvara. Now the kedera would have to be removed because the state of shia can't continue. If the person wants the kedera, wants the tafshil, he can eat the tafshil now. If not, he won't. But the state of shia can't be maintained. That's by way of introduction to the sugya. The second point to make by way of introduction to the sugya is that we're speaking about a kedera that is in a state that it still requires the heter of shehiyah to remain alaysh. But luya tzuya, for example, it would be mavushal kol tzarka, and mitzdamek v'raloy, according to those Rishonim that require that condition, or it's even in mitzdamek v'yofaloy, according to those Rishonim that it's sufficient mavushal kol tzarka. In that case, we no longer need the heter of shehiyah, and the kedera would be able to remain on the eish, even if the eish would lose its status of cotton. And in fact, it's kedai to mention a point which is negeh halacha l'maaseh, that Reb Shlomo Zalman in Shulchan Shlomo, in Siman Reish Nun Gimel, in Ois Hey, subsection Daled, he says that it would be mutter to do the following. Let's say, for example, a person put a kedera on a blech in the common scenario today. Leil Shabbos, he sees that the kedera is mavushal kol tzarkai, and now what he wants to do is remove the blech. Let's say, for example, the fire was low, and the blech is allowing the soup to be at a certain temperature, and he appreciates the soup very, very hot. It's mavushal kol tzarkai, not an issue of mitzdamek v'yofaloi. So he wants to now remove the blech to allow the soup to boil up. It's not mitzdanen, there's no issue of bishul achar, there's no bishul issue. There's no issue of shehiyah because it's mavushal kol tzarkai and not mitzdamek v'yofaloi. So Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, there's no reason to say that he shouldn't be able to remove the blech and leave the kedera. We no longer require the heter of shehiyah for this kedera to remain aloish. The discussion of the sugya is only if the kedera is still in a state that requires the heter of shehiyah, so it's not yet mavushal kol tzarkai, it also be mitzdamek v'yofaloi, according to each shita. But once it's mavushal kol tzarkai, Reb Shlomo Zalman just says 2 points to bear in mind. One, he says, is in order to remove the blech, the kedera has to be slightly lifted. So maybe that would be considered like removing it from the eish, such that to put it then back on the flame would be an issue of chazara, which requires garif and cotton. So Shlomo Zalman says that the slight gap that will then be created between the eish and the kedera is not considered taking it off the eish. 1 point. A second nakuda that Shlomo Zalman makes is a fascinating point in the halacha. He says that luya tzuyir bein hashmashos, the kedera was not yet mavushal kol tzarkai. And the question then is later, hours later, he wants then to remove the kedera and put it directly ala eish. Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, since he couldn't move that kedera bein hashmashos, because Bein Hashmashos he still needed the heter of Shehiyah, because the Kedera wasn't yet Mavushal Kol Tzarkoi, we then have an issue that Bein Hashmashos, that Kedera may have been Muktzeh, because it can't be moved at that point. We then have a klal in Muktzeh, Migud is Katzoi leBein Hashmashos, is Katzoi leKulei Yoima. So even though later on, a couple of hours later, the soup may have reached Mavushal Kol Tzarkoi, it's Muktzeh. So the Shlomo Zalman discusses that shaila, and Beis Hashem in a further limud will have a chance to come back to that question. But the second point to make by way of introduction to the sugya is the sugya is narrowly focused on a kedera which is still in a state that it requires the heter of Shehiyah. Once it reaches the stage of Mavushal Kol Tzarkoi and it's Tamek V'Ralei, according to that shita, where we no longer need the heter of Shehiyah, then again we don't have a sugya. It could actually be Aloish. That's the second point that should be said by way of introduction. Now, what does the Gemara establish? The Gemara establishes the Maskonas HaGemara that once Kotma, it retains the status of Ketuma. And therefore, one can allow a state of Shehiyah to continue. That's the Chiddush of this memra, that Kotma V'Huvara, the Eish retains the status of Ketuma. Now, we'll discuss the Svaras in a moment. We'll discuss Shitas Rashi and Shitas Taisus. But the Ritva in what's called the Chidushei HaRitva HaYeshanim, which are now ascribed to the Ran. Chanan writes like that in the introduction to Tevet Ha'aras, that these Chidushim of the Ritva that were always assumed to be authored by the Ritva are actually probably most likely to be authored by the Ran. The Ritva says that if we take the logic of the Gemara to its conclusion and say that once an Eish underwent Ketima, it retains its status of Ketima, so would we be able to consider the following din? Let's say a person was Kaitem the Eish, and before he ever had a chance to place the Kedera on the Eish to begin the Shehiyah, the Eish became Huvara once again. Would he then be allowed to initiate a Shehiyah on an Eish of Kotma V'Huvara? Would that be allowed? L'chayra, the Gemara says that once the Eish has undergone Ketima, it retains its status of Ketima. Rashi tells us that once there's a Gilui Das, that he intends not to be Chayta the Eish, in the Lashon of the Rishonim, Rashi will say something slightly different, and we'll get to that. But once he's created that Gilui Das, so then l'chayra he should be able to be Masha, even if the Eish by now is Huvara, because he has no interest in the Huvara. The Ritva says Mefurish, that the premise of the Sugya is, and the Ritva actually learns that into the Gemara, the Shita Soi, that in that case, says the Ritva, the Afagav, the Kotma Meikara, the Goli Daite, the Noilichale Bechitu Gichalim, despite the fact that initially there was a Ketima, which demonstrates his Gilui Das, that he has no interest in being Chayta the Gichalim. Afilu Hachi, says the Ritva, Kiven Shehuvara Koidem Shenosan Akdei Al Gabe Kira, only the Mavushal Kol Tzarkoi. We need the heter of Shehiyah. Now the Ritva doesn't explain why that is. It just assumes that as a given in the Gemara, that the Gilui Das, that or such that if it would be Huvara later, the Shehiyah would be allowed to continue. The fact that if it would lose its status of Ketuma, like we said from the Chazon Ish, the state of Shehiyah would have to end. The person would be mechuyev to end the state of Shehiyah. Nonetheless, the Ritva says that would not apply to allow an initial Shehiyah. And the Ritva doesn't explain why. But he explains that that gufa, is the way the Ritva learns the Gemara, is the shakla v'tayr of the Gemara to establish this principle that Kotma V'Huvara only allows an existing Shehiyah to continue, but doesn't allow a Shehiyah to begin in the first place. So that Rabbi Seinu Achreinim don't explain the Ritva clearly, but there is a svara that's quoted b'shem Rabbi Yashiv, that the reason why Kotma V'Huvara does not allow for an initial Shehiyah, but only allows for an existing Shehiyah to continue, Rabbi Yashiv says because a person's das is defined by the state of the Eish at the moment where the Shehiyah begins. So even though there has been a previous Gilui Das, if the Eish at the point of Shehiyah is already Huvar again, then the person once again is involved with the Eish and his previous Gilui Das is irrelevant. Therefore, Rabbi Yashiv said that the heter of our Gemara of Kotam of Huvara only allows for an existing state of Shia to continue because the person's das is defined by the state of the Eish at the point of Shia. This is what the Ritva establishes in Pshat in the Gemara, and this is the explanation which Rebbe Yashiv gives. So to summarize, we're making 3 points in order to give the basic Gedarim of what the Sugya is discussing. One is the assumption of the Gemara, and we're explaining that up here the Chazon Ish, that despite the fact that at the time of Shihir, the Eish had the status of Kotum, if the Eish then loses its status of Kotum, that's Mechayev the person to end the Shihir. One. Second, that we're only referring to a Kedera which requires an ongoing heter of Shihir. But Luyatsuya, the Kedera reaches the state of Mavushal called Sarkai, so it no longer needs the heter of Shihir. Then we don't have the issue of the Gemara, and we even mentioned from Shlomo Zalman that the blech can be removed at that point and it can be placed aloish. And we touched on the issue of Muktzah. The third point is the point of the Ritva, that Kotum of Huvara, even though the Gemara is discussing that the Eish should retain the status of Kotum, that was never going to then allow a Shihir to be initiated. It was only going to be allow a Shihir to continue. Rabbi Yashiv explained, because a person's das is dependent on the state of the Eish at the time of Shihir, and therefore a previous Gilui das wouldn't be effective if at the time of the Shihir, the Eish had now lost its status of, even despite the fact that the Eish at this point has lost its status of Kot. Now let's see, what is the Svara? Why the Eish retains its status of Kotma despite the fact that it's presently Huvara? Why should that be so? We have a lashon of Rashi, where Rashi says, "V'goli daite denoynichale betzimuke," because by the person being koitem, he has been megala das that he no longer wishes for the tavshel to be installed.
Can I ask where the Rashi is?
Yes, Lamed Zayin on the base. Rashi Dibur Amaskil Shani Mocha the Kot.
You put up page 3, please. Okay. Yeah.
The lashon of Rashi here is difficult.
It's on the 5 lines from the bed.
We would have assumed that if the Eish would retain its status of Kotma, the reason for that would be because by the person having initially done a Ma'aseh Ketima, that shows that it's Megala Das, that he no longer is involved in the Eish. We're familiar, we've come across this a number of times now, that besides for the Shita of the Rambam, unique Shitas Rambam, that he's the Siach Das from the Tavshel, Roy Rishonim understand that what Gareth and Kotum accomplished is a Gilui Das, that the person does not intend to alter the Eish, and therefore his Goli Daite that he will not be Mechat.
What's the exact definition of this context of Tzimuke?
We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, we'll just point out what Rashi, we would have expected Rashi to say, and then we'll try to find what Rashi actually does. So, for example, if we would look at the Lashon of the Mishnah Berurah, in similar Rishon in the Maranquamus booklet, that is on page 73 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages.
The Elam is giving us our respect.
The Mishnah Berurah towards the end of Sivkot and Dalet gives us a brief summary of the basic svara of Rov Rishonim into what Gareth and Kotum accomplishes. It says, "V'hatam b'chol zeh." The reason, the basic logic underlying all these dinim, kiven de golidaite de loiboi la gicholim. Since he has shown that he doesn't require the gecholim, meaning he's no longer involved in the state of the gecholim, de bevadai loy osi lechatuyeh. So therefore, we can assume that then he will not come to be mechata. So the key phrase that the Mishnah Berurah here uses is kivan de gilo daitoi deloi boi legecholim. He's shown that he does not intend to alter the gecholim in any way. So if we were to then apply that, and the Rishonim say this mefurish, saw just now the lashon of the ritva like that if we would want to then explain the underlying svara of the Gemara of why Kotma of the Huvara should maintain the status of Kotma, we would say, Kivan de Goli Daite, using Lashon Rashi, Goli Daite, and to use then to add to that the phrase of the Mishnah Berurah, the Goli Daite is the Loiboi La Gechol. He's shown initially that he doesn't intend to be involved in the Gecholim, so the subsequent Huvara doesn't change his intentions for the Gecholim, and therefore it retains the status of Kotum. Having once been Megala Daito, like Rabbi Yashiv said, since B'Shas, the Tchilas Ma'aseh She'iyah, his das was on the state of the Eish. Then the Eish was Kotum, and that would be sufficient. But Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says that Golidaite denoinichale betzimuke, which means etzimuk, which means the progress of Bishul, its stomach, is loinichale. He has no interest in any change that this Tavshil is subsequently going to undergo. And therefore, the reason why he'll be Mechata is not because he's been Mesiach Das on the Eish, but because he has no interest in any change in the Tavshil. So Rashi clearly has differed from the Rishonim on this. Now, let's make 2 points. Before discussing why Rashi differed, let's first discuss what Rashi is actually saying. So we learned together the Tosfos on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, where Tosfos in his second Mahalach of the Gemara says that this Gemara that establishes that Kotma v'Huvara retains the status of Ketuma, the Gemara never intended that it retains complete status of Ketuma. That's not what the Gemara meant. The Gemara meant that the Eish still has certain aspects of the din of Kotum, but is not entirely Kotum. L'mayin afkimin of Tosfos. So Tosfos says, "V'oiga shleimer shani nocha de Kotma." The lav legamre mahani ktima. The initial ktima isn't entirely effective. Elodavka mishum de boshel called sarkoi. It only allows the continuation of the shia because it's mavashal called sarkoi. Avaloi bishel called sarkoi. If it wouldn't be mavashal called sarkoi, where normally, if the eish would be kotum, one can be masha something even if it's not mavashal called sarkoi. What's the reason why? Also mishum de huvara. Because it's huvara. The Tosfos says, "V'hasta oshti shapir holding akat hocha kotum huvara udele'el nokat nislabsa. The nislabsa have a pochus mi huvara. V'have legamri kektuma." There are 2 possible descriptions or levels. Thank you. Of what the eish, how the eish can change. One is huvara, which is the Gemara Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, and the other is nislabsa, which is the expression of the Gemara on the Amud Aleph. So Tosfos nislabsa just means that it becomes somehow, again, it becomes somehow inflamed, which is a flare, which is much smaller. Huvara means there's now actual fire. Says Tosfos, if the presence of actual fire, if there's huvara, if there's a havara, if there's burning, and in that case, it only partially retains its status of ketuma. That's what Tosfos says. The Achronim are then medayik that Rashi seems to agree with this premise of Tosfos. That Rashi only allowed Shani Hocha de Kotma because it's loinichale betzimuke, which means if we're discussing shihir of a tavshil which is in a state of being mavushal called tzorkei but mitztamek only, then Rashi was matir. The Gilui Das only goes as far as being matir the mitztamek v'yofaloi, but the shihir, the status of Kotum will not allow in the case of not mavushal called tzarkei. This point is made mefurish by Rabbi Elazar Moshe and his Hagois, as the Shir Achana concluded with, where Rabbi Elazar Moshe says, he says, "Mitoich dvaro," from Rashi's words, "Dibur masel shani hocha de kotum lomadati." I derived the severely that Rashi holds deloi havia kektuma, The Eish doesn't retain total status of Katan. It gives the Tavshil the status of Mitztamik Viraloi. And Rashi Shita is that once it arrives at the state of Mitztamik Viraloi, there's no issue of Shia. Why? And he says, I'm sorry?
You turned it higher.
Excuse me one second. Tzvi, can you hear me? Is it too loud or too low? What's the problem? She'll declare up. It's fuzzy. Rabbi Yitzchak, go to work, please, here. Okay, we'll try and go by size. Sorry. Location of mic. I know. We're playing with the location of the mic. The mic is too close. Before other people complain, the mic was too far. Sounds like Orthodox Jews. Okay. Can we? Is it better now? I know, because it goes up some, but this is good enough. Okay, everybody. So we're trying.
Can we see the Moshe from Zalman, if we want to go to the original text?
Either way, I've really concluded that
it's good that way. Okay. Okay.
Where Moshe shows from this Rashi that Rashi agrees to places that it doesn't maintain the status of full status. The Moshe then proceeds to give an afkinina ladina that. Besides for the actual discussion of Rashi in places, which we'll come back to, that the heter of Kotma V'Huvara only applies to a Tavshil, Muvushal called Sarkai, that's still Mitzam B'Yafaloi. But also Moshe says there's an additional afkinina, and we'll return to this place, that because Kotma V'Huvara doesn't give the Eish an absolute status of Kotma, it doesn't retain Ketima. Therefore, says Rabbi Moshe, Chazorah on such an Eish is possible. Which means if the Tavshil is removed, ordinarily Chazorah, the conditions of Chazorah met, the Tavshil can be returned to an Eish that's far from bottom. In this case, says Moshe, Chazorah can't be. He says, the Kalmar Hocha, the Kalmar, the Morris Mastama, which says that Shani Hocha the Kochma, the love the Gamri Kiftuma. Why? The also like Haxir. The Gemara never said Chazorah is muted. The Gemara only said Bishul. Chazorah is not muted. So therefore, we have from the Diuk of Rashi two dinim. One is that Rashi, like Tosfos, was only ever matir the din of Huvar the Kotma, that the Eish retains its status of Kotma. The Indian be made on Mitzvah Kriyofaloi, but not on Bushel, not yet Bushel called Sarabay. And second, that it won't be matir Chazorah. So that's, as we say, was stated actually. So we first pointed out to summarize how Rashi differs from what we would have expected him to say, and which other Rishonim clearly say, that the basis of Chotam of Ugufar, or maintaining its status of Chotam, is not because that the Gilui Das, that he's no longer interested in being involved in the Eish, continues. Rashi doesn't say that. Second, Rashi is more like Tosfos, that the status of retaining the status of Chotam only allows a partial heter of Mitzvah Kriyofaloi, but doesn't allow training of Bushel Sarko. And third, also the Moshe with that based on this Rashi places, the Chazorah is also. These are the 3 points that are mavur in Rashi. Now, what was Machmiyah Rashi to say this? Why can't Rashi write? Simple, like the other Rishonim. That the reason why Chotam of Mavur retains its status is because God united that he's not going to be involved in the Eish. Here, the Kriya Godin makes cheshbon different. And he says like this. He says, and this is a perfect opportunity to have a brief chazor as we end the Sukkah Shkia, back to an Indian that we discussed at the very beginning of the Sukkah. Rashi Shita is, you will recall, that the Gezerah of Shkia is no different than the Gezerah of Hatzumana, the Davar HaMoisef. Rashi said that initially in the Mishnah, that the basis of the Isser of Shehiyah is no different than the Isser of Hatmana. Leaving a Kedera on an exposed, unaltered Eish is fundamentally Hatmana. Tosfos asks, and the Rishonim are managing this question, so how does Garaf and Cotton then help? What does Garaf and Cotton then do? Garaf and Cotton is still Ma'aseh Hevel. So Hatmana is also the Davar Ma'aseh Hevel, and therefore Garaf and Cotton should be effective to take away the Zebra Chitur, as if written in the Rishonim. Rashi's report regarding to the diet, the number of steel. Then Rashi says that what does Garaf and Cotton accomplish? Rashi holds that Garaf and Cotton actually accomplishes a cooling of the Becholim. Rashi says it before it. Actually, he says Rashi in the Mishnah. Well, the Tzadimon Rashi says the Aver that's placed on top of the Becholim cools the Becholim. The Mela says that according to Rashi, the Zera of Shehiyah is because it's analogous to the Zera of Hatmon. The only solution that Garaf and Cotton offers is a cooling of the Eish, so it's no longer Ma'aseh Hevel. And the Rashi in fact asks that. It's still Ma'aseh Hevel despite Garaf and Cotton. So the Rishonim struggle with Rashi and Tzias. But Zotah Pri Megolim, once it's Huvarah, then the Tzinon has ended. So Rashi never has the sugya of Gilui Das in Garaf and Cotton. Rashi's sugya is that the only thing that Garaf and Cotton can ever be effective with is actually to douse the Eish Kulit. Memela says in Pri Megolim, Cotton of the Huvarah can never be a Dintima according to Rashi. Because once it's Ma'aseh Hevel in Metzios, we have back to Zera Batman. Therefore, Rashi was forced to be Mechadish, that the only reason why Cotton of Huvarah retains the status of Ketima is unique Svara that the Gilui Das that I no longer wish that its stomach to take place is now the basis of the head. Therefore, Memela Rashi is the Hadash entire Svara unrelated to the Sugya of Garaf and Cotton. That what we can do is say that since initially it was Garaf, therefore the Grifo that shows he's not no longer interested in its stomach for the offer, and therefore it can retain the status of Cotton in as much as the only issue now is its stomach for the offer. But if the issue is Bishul, then there's no validated that he doesn't want Bishul says the previous other. Of course, he wants to eat a kavshel as this bashal called Tzarka. Therefore, if he wants to eat a kavshel as this bashal called Tzarka, we need true Garaf and Cotton. If we need true Garaf and Cotton, Rashi sheet is, then we need the Eish to be down. We need it standard. It's not like standard, it's Garaf. This is the Cheshbon Niflok that the Pri Megolim makes. This is Rashi L'Shitosoi, going back to one of the most basic fundamental machlokes in the Sugya Shehiyah between Rashi and the others. So this is the Yesod, of Shehiyah. Why is this relevant? Because we've established now that we have Shittas Rashi that Cotton of Huvarah is only relevant from its standpoint of life. And we have Shittas HaTosfos that we just saw that says first that Cotton of Huvarah is only effective for the din of but not by Einim Elushal Chol Tzarka. That was Tosfos diuk in the Gemara. We also have Rabbi Elazar Moshe's diuk that L'Shittas Rashi and Tosfos that Cotton of Huvarah doesn't retain the full status of Cotton, that Chazara is also awesome. Now, how do we pass on the din? So, the Pella is, as the Yeshua points out, that in fact the entire din of Cotton of Huvarah is absent from posting, not in the Rif and not in Shulchan Aruch. The actual din of Cotton of Huvarah is not brought in Shulchan Aruch at all. Where is it brought? It's brought in a Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham in Siman Reish Nun Gimel Sifkat and Gimel. So in the pages, in the booklet pages, this Magen Avraham is on page 47. On the words of the Mechaber, where the Mechaber paskins the basic din of Kotma, Kisa HaGicholim. The Magen Avraham says, on the words of the Mechaber, Shekisa HaGicholim Be'efer, the Magen Avraham is right side of the page. towards on the very last line, on the very first of the narrow lines of the Magen Avraham. Shekisa gecholim be'if. Zog the Magen Avraham. Ve'ein tzorich liktoim ad she'ein nikar sham eish klal. One doesn't have to douse it so extensively that there is no tongue of flame at all. Rak b'ktuma kol shehu sad. As long as it's kotum to some extent, that's enough. That's based on a ran, which the Beis Yosef brings the halach. On that, the Magen Avraham says that since I have just established the din, that kotmo doesn't require a total dousing of the eish. It only requires, in the lashon of the Magen Avraham, kotmo kol shehu. Therefore, says the Magen Avraham, afilu huvaro achar kach shori. Even if then it would burst into flames, it would be mutter. Why? Kevon de gilo daitoi deloi boi la gecholim sagi. So the Magen Avraham doesn't bring lashon Rashi. He brings the lashon of the other Rishonim. That the basis of Kotma V'Huvara is there's a Gilui Das that since he was initially Megala Das, that he does not require the Gecholim, so therefore that's sufficient to retain the status of Ketuma. So it doesn't appear in the Ikar Rishonim, it doesn't appear in Shulchan Aruch, but the Magen Avraham said it's a Gemara Mefureshes. There doesn't seem to be any challenge to the Maskon of the Gemara that Kotma V'Huvara is mutter. Says the Magen Avraham. If it would be Kotma V'Huvara, Afilu Huvara Achakach Shori, Kivan the Gali Daite. That's the Ladina of the that's Ladina of the Magen Avraham. Frek the Pnei Yeshua, how could the Magen Avraham paskin a din that's neither brought in the Ikar Rishonim, not in the Rif, not in Shulchan Aruch, and the Magen Avraham can paskin a din based on the Gemara? It's not brought by the Rishonim, it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. How can the Magen Avraham paskin it? Zog the Pnei Yeshua v'loi oid. Hare, we have Shitas Rashi and Shitas Tosfos that says that retaining the status of Kotum V'Huvara, that's Kotum, is only b'negea to mitztamik v'yofaloi, not to einam official kol tzarkoi. So again, how could the Magen Avraham, even if he's right to bring the din of the Gemara, bring it unqualified and just say Kotum V'Huvara is mutter? How could that then be? As they frekt the Pnei Yeshua. Now, there are 2 points here to be made in terms of being able to establish the din of the Magen Avraham. The first point to make in the Gemara is that, and this point is made by the Pri Megadim, if one looks on page 48, on the page of the Maramakomis, on the facing page of the Shulchan Aruch, in the Eshel Avram of the Pri Megadim. He says, the Eshel Avram just briefly refers to Ayin Pnei Yeshua Sham, Kedarkoi of the Pri Megadim. And he says, in the words before that, V'hamogen Avram nokat lo l'kula b'midi d'Rabbanan. The Magen Avraham was noiket lahokel because the sugya over here is a din. The sugya over here is a din d'Rabbanan. In other words, what the Pri Megadim is establishing is if it's not clear why the poskim were mashmit the din, and the Pnei Yeshua says it's because perhaps the poskim were mesupik if the Gemara meant to establish this lamaskam. And if we're mesupik whether or not we should say that the heter of Kotmov and Islab and Huvara applies even to Einim Abushal Kol Tzarkai. Zok the Pri Megadim a simple taina, Soif Kosoif, we're discussing Gzeres D'Rabbanan. And in Gzeres D'Rabbanan we can go lahakal. So in the machloikes of Rashi and Tosfos, the Umas other Rishonim, does the heter apply only by mitzdamek v'yofaloi? We can certainly go l'kula. And the shaila, the hashmata of the Rishonim, if we don't know how necessarily to explain why this is nishmat in the Shulchan Aruch and the Rif, perhaps we have a right again to go l'kula, and therefore the Magen Avraham is correct in bringing down both dinim. This is what the Pri Megadim says in order to be able to be miyashev the das of the Magen Avraham. Now we saw in the preparation the Shara Tzion, where the Shara Tzion, so going to the Mishnah Berurah's pages, page 73 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages, the Shara Tzion touches on this shaila. Sifkat and Yud Zayin, he says, Hine ba Tosfos isa lechatirutza. Tosfos holds according to one teretz, and we said that was also Shitas Rashi. De ba'oifen zeh, in the case of Kotum V'Huvara, Einoi mutter rak bin nisbashal kol tzorkoi umit stamik v'yofeloi. Aber bin nisbashal ktsas oser kiven de huvaro. Uba mogin avrom loi hetik zeh mishum desveike de rabbanon hu. Du ulai kitirut zakama prima God. That's what we saw so far. Zok the sharat ziru and v'loi tzorich lezeh. The Horamban masik da v'ketuma lekol mili v'chein mashma v'chedushi Horam v'aritva. Zok the sharat zion. Although the teretz of the Pri Megadim, of course, is correct, it's not necessary. Why? Because, let's go back to first principles. We said that the basis of Shitas Rashi and Shitas Tosfos is because an Eish of Kotum of Uhuvaro doesn't retain entirely its status of Kotum. Why? So we said Rashi says because the Eish now is Moisef Hever. And Tosfos has a svara that once it's Huvaro, it can no longer be considered entirely Kotum. Zok the Sharat Zion, if one actually looks at the Rishonim, the predominant svara in the Rishonim is that the whole premise of Rashi and Tosfos isn't true. Loi meboya l'shittas Rashi that the Rishonim b'chlau don't agree that the effect of Ketima is to make it not Moisef Hever and to be Mitzanim. And in Shittas Tosfos, the Rishonim don't accept that Kotum of Ahura doesn't have the full status of Ketima. So the Mogen Avram simply applied the psak of Rov Rishonim that Kotum of Ahura is considered entirely Kotum. So Ledina, we have the Shita of the Mogen Avram as the Sharatzion establishes it, that an Eish that is Kotum of Ahura retains the full status of Ketima. So to summarize, we have two approaches to understand the Mogen Avram. One is Sofik de Rabbanon Lekula, that we know perhaps don't have to consider Shittas Rashi and Shittas Tosfos, or that the entire Chiddush of Rashi and Tosfos is rejected by the Rishon. L'may nafkemina. The nafkemina is, what about the din of Chazara? If the din of Kotum of Ahuvara goes as far as the Sharat Tzion wants it to go, that the Eish actually is Kotum entirely, it's like nothing ever happened. So Chazara would also be mutter. But if we understand that there is some change in the status of the Eish, it's not entirely Kotum, and the Machlokas of Rishonim is, can we still be makel to allow a Shehiyah? Then, like Rabbi Elazar Moshe said, maybe it's only Shehiyah, not Chazara. Zok Reb Shlomo Zalman in Svara, and that's brought in the footnote in Shmir Shabbos Hilchos. Zok Reb Shlomo Zalman, let's go through the chain of reasoning that we just had. We had a Pnei Yeshua that said that the Shulchan Aruch never brings the heter of Kotum of V'huvara. So perhaps we don't have a right to paskin the Kula. The whole Mogen Avram is questionable. V'oid, we have Shittas, Rashi, and Tosfos that say that even if we allow Kotum of V'huvara, it's only because it allows for Nitztamik V'yofeloi, but not for Einim Avushal. It's the Chiddush of the Sharat Tzion that the Eish is so identical to Ketima that therefore the Mogen Avram paskin the Gamri Lekula. Zok Shlomo Zalman, maybe that's only to allow the May Halacha L'Maisa is Shehiyah, but not Chazara. Maybe Kotum of Ahuvara was never matter Chazara. This is the tzad. This is the issue that Shlomo Zalman raises. And Shlomo Zalman then said, "V'shuv Omar HaGrasha Zatzal." V'shuv Noivet brings down from Shlomo Zalman, "Ta'achiluk ben lishois lahachzer einay nochain." The stima of the Brisa is Mavur, that it retains full status of Ketima. He says, Achras, Achroin, the Shapir Mutter, Ben Lishois, so that's the point that we reach in the Maskonas HaGemara, that the stima of the Achroinim is, as the Sharatzion establishes, that it retains full status of Ketima. Well, what's that based on? Once he was Megala Das, the Shehiyah is Mutter. Now, there is a very important point lahalacha here, which even though doesn't seem to be muskab poskim in the head yet, if one can, is a Hilchos HaRav l'Shabsal, which is kedai to be medaktik in if possible. And that's like this. The Rishonim use the Lashon Golidaite initially in the Ketima that he's no longer interested in being involved in the Eish. Shlomo Zalman in Shulchan Shlomo raises a very basic problem with that in the way that we put our blechs on the oven. On the stovetop. How do we place our blech? We put the blech on, and then adjust the knob until we reach the level of fire that we want. So Zok Reb Shlomo Zalman, if the gorof and kotum is accomplished by placing the blech on the flame, that says, Goli Daite, that you're no longer interested in the Eish, but then you went and changed the level of the Eish. So it's a steer minei ubei. Your whole Gilui Das is wrong. Monoshach, if you place the blech, don't touch the Eish. And if you're touching the Eish, the blech is pointless. Now, it's important to emphasize that there is a Mishnah Berurah that brings on the Pri Megadim, that what happens in the Lashon of the Mishnah Berurah, and if you can see the Mishnah Berurah on the same page, on page 73, where the Mishnah Berurah brings, at the end of Sifkat Yudalot, he said, Oid Isa, the Achronim also say, the Gecholim Sha'omemu, Gecholim that are weakening, they're slowly going out. Hainu Shahuch Shach Ktsas Marisom, they're darkening, so they're no longer glowing or white from heat. Harehin Ktuma, they are automatically considered cotton. The Hatam, and the reason is, to Kevan Shalei Choshash Lilaboisam Shalei Umamu, Muchamilsa Sheini Kopet Bechitui. Since he hasn't deliberately stoked them, he shows that he's not interested. So we could possibly be miyashav the minig ha'olam to adjust the flame once the blech's been placed by saying that since the adjustment, the person didn't make the flame higher, he just adjusted it so it should be correct. So even though the blech didn't achieve the garaf and kotum, but since now the fire is left as is and he's clearly no longer adjusting it, perhaps that would be enough. Maybe he will continue. But here comes a critical point. Let's look at the Mishnah Berurah says in the Bir Halacha. He says that in that case when the gecholim were doused by themselves, and that also accomplishes kotum, says the Pri Megadim, but if it would be huvar then, if it would then burst into flames, it would no longer retain the status of ketuma. Why? Because you would have a megaladas. It's a de facto. But you would have a megaladas. So in that case, if that happens, you won't be able to mechat anymore. As ich steht in Pri Megadim. If you return to the Pri Megadim that we previously saw in Shulchan Aruch, page 48 in the Maramakomis pages, at the end of that Pri Megadim, second column of the Eshel Avram, says the Pri Megadim, he says Umihu in the very last line, second column, 3 lines down, end of the third line, beginning with after the period, beginning with the word Umihu. He says Umihu Omamu, if they went out by themselves, V'huvara, Hodra Milsa Lekamaisa. The Eish then became a full status of Eish and loses its status of cotton. Why? Deloy Shayich Bekan Iludas.
Or
Shach
that is Mavutal.
Shach Bekan Iludas. Because
It happened afterwards.
It's not telling this Giludas anymore.
why? Every time I'm koitem, my Giludas stays. That's what we said from the Mogen Avraham. Once I was Megaladas, Huvara means I was Megaladas. Zot Pri Megadim, but that's only if you didn't act to be Megaladas. But if you didn't act to be Megaladas, it's merely a de facto ketuma because we infer that by the fact that you didn't go and reignite the gecholim, we see that you're not interested in involving the gecholim. That's not sufficient. If it would be Huvara, it would be awesome. Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, then Afkamina would then be like this. Even if it will be makel to allow you to adjust the knob, but if the blech then fell off, it's not kotum anymore. So Reb Shlomo Zalman says, and Reb Elyashiv held like this also, that lechatchila, just in order that the blech should be gara from kotum, one should not adjust the flame after the blech is put on. That's the first thing. V'oid, if one did do it and one's been soimich, it's perhaps, and the blech then falls off, it's perhaps better not to be soimich. But Ladina, both Ladina and Shlomo Zalman held that in the same way as kotum of Huvara, now let's come Be'ez Hashem to halacha l'maisa. We've established the din of kotum of Huvara, and we've established that the pashtus is that should be effective even for chazara, like the Sha'ar Tziyun says, because kotum of Huvara retains absolute status of kotum. What about if our blech would become dislodged? What does that also have the status of kotum of Huvara? So Reb Shlomo Zalman held that Avada does. Hainuach. Once, when was Megala Das, Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, the Eish retains its status of Kotel. Despite the fact that Rav Shlomo Zalman himself, as we saw, was noted to say that perhaps it doesn't help Legabi Chazar, but certainly Legabi Shehir, Rav Shlomo Zalman held, it should maintain the status of Kotel. Dr. Moshe and Igros Moshe says no. And he's discussing the din of Chazara, but Moshe Svara there would be no distinction between Shia and Chazara. Dr. Igros Moshe, page 121 of the booklet, Ois Lamed. Dr. Moshe, he was asked, "In Nofal Ablech b'Shabbos hamimutu lahachzir b'la'adov, can one be soymech l'maisa on kotma v'nislabsa?" Dr. Moshe, no. He says, "Mistaber de bekotma afshe nislabsa." In the case of the Gemara, ikke ktsas heker eich shekotma. There's still some indication, some recognizable effect on the age of the initial ketima. The after mitchiloloi sagi beloy kisag gecholim. You don't have to cover all the gecholim. However, Dr. Moshe, kiven shekotam kula v'huvra gecholim hamikutamim loynesa kim shekili daita the ketima is still there. Just the eish is flaring up through the ketima. What happened? He covered the eish with sand, and through the sand, the fire is the tongues of fire are leaping up. But the basic heker of the ketima is still present. If it would be conceivable that the Efer would be swept out, there's nothing to indicate his initial gilidas. If the blech entirely fell off, and if a corner of the blech still is there, yesh lahatik. The Igros Moshe swore in the floor. He says, we made a mistake in the sugya. We understood that once Gilui Das is always Gilui Das. That's the entire sugya here. So once the person has shown that he's Megala Daita, that he doesn't want to be Chayte, that Gilui Das remains in effect. So that's not the svara. The svara is because the Gilui Das is still present in the Ketima. The Ketima is still there. So even though in Metzias, the Ketima is no longer effective, but the Gilui Das is still present. The Ketima is there. The Blech was Neifel, no Gilui Das. Shlomo Zalman differed from Ramesh at this point, and he says, "V'lo mistaber lechalik." If you go back to the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, he says, "V'lo mistaber lechalik ben osa ma'ase begufa eish or yishrak hiniach pach v'hu nofal." Shlomo Zalman made an entirely different premise in the sugi than Ramesh. Ramesh is the chiddush nifla on the sugya that the only reason why the Gilui Das remains is because the Maisa is still present in some way. So Shlomo Zalman, that's not the svara. The svara is once Gilui Das is always Gilui Das. So how would we possibly explain a chiluk between a blech falling off and the ketima becoming ineffective? Zod Shlomo Zalman, the only difference would be is that placing ketima means I was megala das in the eish itself. But where I place a blech, maybe my gilui das wasn't in the eish. And you know what it's like? Abba said, let's recall the din of the Pri Megadim. It's like a de facto kotum. It's like gecholim which started to fizzle out. Where it's a de facto gilui das. And in that case where it's huvaro says the Pri Megadim, and the Bialacha paskins this, in that case, we no longer retain the status of kotum huvaro. So Zot Shlomo Zalman, not a chiluk. He says, "Lo mistaber lechalek ben osat ma'ase begufa eish or rakiniach pachlu nafal." No difference. Once he does a ma'ase, that accomplishes full gilui das.
So if a guy puts on the black, it's a problem.
So we'll get to that. I'm not sure if we will have time, and I think we're almost out of time. But we'll maybe perhaps in a further limud we'll try that. The oifen that we have a fundamental machlokes ben Rabbi Seinu. What the simple understanding of Kotam V'Huvar is, now that we've seen Be'ez Hashem the Sugya together. Reb Moshe understands Kotam V'Huvar is a kula that where a partial ketima remains, the Gilui Das remains effective because it latches onto the partial ketima. Shlomo Zalman says that's not the svara. The svara is once you will megala das, Gilui Das remains. The only reason that a blech may not be like that is because perhaps a blech is never a Gilui Das in the Gufa Eish. It's only like the Pri Megadim's Gecholim She'omamu. And then Huvara is ineffective, says the Pri Megadim. So the Shlomo Zalman, there's no chiluk. There's no chiluk if the mice is begufa ish, alo ish, same thing. Therefore, Shlomo Zalman's maskana is, lule that he then brings the Igros Moshe, achar isi b'shuv Igros Moshe, not like that, that therefore the ish retained full status of kotel. So to summarize now briefly, la halacha, what we have, based on the sugya is we arrived in the Mogen Avram, for halacha l'maisa, that we established the Sharat Tzion's din, that kotel magulvar as an absolute kotel. Sofik, machlokes in the Rabbanon Lekula, it's an absolute kotel. But however, Moshe says that's not true in our blech. And in the case where our blech falls, eish mamish. The whole sugya doesn't apply. Shlomo Zalman says it does, but it won't be matir chazara. And that we see is mavur in Rabbi Elazar Moshe. So, but however, Ladina Rabbi Shlomo Zalman concedes that the Ma'aseh will be soimich on the Sharat Tzion, and will apply the heta to our blech. The din would be that it would retain full status of Garv and Kotum, and it would be matir even chazar. That's the sikum of the sugya to this point.
Well, a crack pot. What's a crack pot?
So a crock pot depends on the shaila whether or not we consider a crock pot Garv and Kotum, which I imagine was discussed in another shir, and then that would depend directly on that.
What could fall off in a crack pot?
The silver fall. What the black falls off? Do you remember black falls?
So this,
fire?
yeah,
We discussed that it could be partially, right? Partially the mixers. It could be pushed off the fire. But see, it's going to happen. Okay, let's 1 minute.
So this is the point in which we wanted to arrive at the sugya and the dina, the din of our blech, if it becomes dislodged, is shani and machlokes between Shlomo Zalman and the Moshe, and with dina, if that would happen, one would have to know what to be made with dina in this case. Just to end with some brief vodvri מחשבה, as we do Be'ez Hashem. We had mentioned in last week's Nima. These are the days of the last third of the periods of the Sfira Soimer. We had mentioned from the Chasam Sofer Josh's. The period of Sfira Soimer is divided into 3 parts. Connected 3 Amudin, and the final approach towards the answer to Shavuos, the period in which we're in Proisat Zeres, is connected that Amud of Torah. And we're actively engaged in the most intense achona now towards being Zeicha to Kabbalah Zater. In the beginning, the parasha begins with In B'chukoisai Teilechu, where Amelus B'Torah and Bichlal, the Kiyum of Ratzon Hashem, is referred to with the Lashon of Halicha, a Lashon which you find a lot in the Lashonos of both Mikra and Lashonos Chazal, V'holachto B'drachov, Ma'nitzades Bon of Loleches, Torah describes the Ma'ila of Avraham Avinu. Kiyum of the Ratzon of the Rabbeinu Shalom, and specifically Eisek HaTorah, is referred to with the Lashon of Halicha. Why is that? What's signified in the Lashon of Halicha? Torah, the Gemara says in the beginning of Kiddushin on Daf Beis and Beis, Torah Ikri Derech. The Torah is called the Derech. That's the Gemara establishes that Torah is called, the entirety of Torah is called Derech. Why is it that Torah is called the Derech? What the Chazal revealing to us about Torah by calling it Derech? The Gra in the Bir Gra to Mishlei towards the beginning of Perek Aleph. The Gra says because beyond specific Ramachim Shasad, we got beyond specific Taryag Mitzvahs. Torah in its entirety establishes a derech for a person. There's something called derech HaTorah. And even questions, dinim, situations which aren't directly referred to and subsumed under a category of one of the Taryag Mitzvahs, from the entirety of the body of Torah comes a derech of how to conduct oneself in that instance. In fact, it's kedai to mention a Yesod which is brought in the beginning of the Sefer Malas HaTorah, which is authored by Avraham Chi HaGra, the son of Avraham Ben HaGra, and he had a brother Avraham, where he quotes a chidush in the name of his brother the Goy. And he says the following. He says, we know that the Rishonim have very far-reaching machlokes about what is or isn't counted as a Tayyag mitzvah. The Bahag, the Rambam, the Ramban, the Smag, the Zohar Rakia. These are sugyas that the Gedolei HaRishonim and Ischar. Says the Goin L'didan ein b'zeh nafkamina. Has no different nafkamina to us, which is a very difficult statement because the Achronim clearly established broad nafkaminas as to whether something is an Iker mitzvah or not. But he says L'didan ein nafkamina. Why? Because the Rishonim are only trying to establish what's a sheirish and what's an anaf. What is the fundamental premise, and are other dinim of the Torah than corollaries of that? But says that going every word of Torah is mitzvah. There's nothing in the Torah that if you wouldn't know how to sufficiently understand what the Torah is referring to, we wouldn't be able to derive from that halacha. Just don't always know. An example of this. Beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, the Ramban says that all the halachas of how to be oisek together with the Malchus is learned from the Maisa of Yaakov and Esau. Right? Rashi brings in a Medrash Rabbah. Kodim that he would go to the Kesar, he would be learning this parasha. Parashas of Torah, kol kulam Torah. Every word of Torah, says the guy, says we don't know always how to derive halacha, but Torah in its entirety creates derech. So then we understand that that's the basis of why in Mikra it's referred to halicha, because in the derech one is hayach. Now that just seems to be linguistics, that's lashon. Since we've described that the Torah in totality is a derech, so therefore meaning the Torah gives us an overarching approach, a derech, a road, a map, a guideline. So therefore, following that is called halicha. But what does that really mean? So perhaps just briefly to add a very basic thing that we learn from the Nefesh HaChaim. And we'll make the Haggadah. This part is not the Nefesh HaChaim, we'll make the Haggadah. If one thinks about one's conscious and unconscious motions, halicha is one of the most unconscious motions that we do. When we walk, we don't concentrate on how we walk. When we move our arms, we do. Many other bodily motions, we have to focus on what we're doing. Halicha is automatic. And this is a point that's discussed. But that halicha is almost something which is automatic. One just walks. So the pella, halicha b'darchei haTorah should be something that is called, referred to a maisa of the guf, which is of the most unintended and unplanned and unfocused maisa of the guf. We should call that halicha. Why is this the lashon? We understand that it fits with the Torah being called derech, but why is halicha the maisa, which the Torah then describes as being melech b'darchei Hashem? So just briefly to touch on a broad yesod, and Hashem will touch on it next week more b'harchava. The Nefesh HaChaim says that one of the effects of Torah being yored la'aretz, he alludes to this in Nefesh HaChaim in Prakim, and it's more b'harchava and Hilchos printed in the Sidagra. One of the most basic aspects of Torah being nitan la'aretz means that unlike the other Sakadoshim who could only be Mekayim mitzvahs by understanding the greatest soiv that lies at the heart of the mitzvah and what the mitzvah will accomplish in ruchnias, we don't have to know that. And the Torah, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave our physical meisim a similar ruchniistic impact than the greatest kavanas and yichudim and tikkunim that the Avos HaKadoshim intended. HaRav says the Nefesh HaChaim that there's a mandamah that says mitzvah says shichas kavanah. One can be mekayim a mitzvah perfunctorily, and it's still a mitzvah. The koyach of Amidah La'aretz means the Rebbeinu Shalom endowed and imbued the ma'aseh ha'evarim of a yid with the koyach of being ma'aseh kedusha in the bria. That's what we're saying when we're saying that Torah, going the darchei Torah, is called halicha. Of course, ideally, there's an approach of being able to understand the intent and the depth of Torah to the extent that we can be mechavan to all that Torah intends us to understand and all the depth that Torah intends us to know. But in fact, what the Torah is doing with Gala is that simply performing the derech HaTorah is the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom and accomplishes the Ratzon of the Torah. When we say V'halachta b'drachav, it means we want to train ourselves, we want to sublimate ourselves, so that our unintended halicha has the impact of being Mekayim the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That's what halicha means. We no longer need to retain the madrega of the avos that we can only accomplish mitzvahs by understanding the sodas and the tikkunim. Once Torah was yered la'aretz, a simple ma'aser mitzvah of a yid accomplishes what the Torah wants it to accomplish. That's why it's called halicha. The Torah is ikri derech, but when the person's holech in the derech, what he accomplishes by being holech in the derech is because just like the unintended walking brings him to his destination, halicha means that even something that he does without being fully cognizant and without being fully aware or being granted yet the understanding of the depth of his ma'aser, still the ma'aser itself accomplishes that inyan. One of the inyanim of achanas haTorah is to be mischazik and appreciate that the impact of a Bo Moshe B'Huvida La'aretz, what that did. It says in Chaim, it shifted from being the avodah of the avos, which required inspiration, it required understanding, it required insight, to simply be the kaddish l'maisa evarim, to appreciate what it means to simply be hoylech b'derech haTorah, ma'asim that we do, and the koach and the kedusha and the impact that the Be'ez Hashem.
I apologize for the sound machinations.